Thank you. We believe on side proposition that the goal of the Olympics should be to promote culture and sports in the most effective way possible. And it is on that basis that we propose the resolution that we should establish one permanent center for the Olympic Games to be held each Olympiad. In my speech, first I'll be getting into the criteria and their model, and then I'll be getting into my 2 points, that of the Olympic economics and removing politics from sports, and my friend Oliver is going to talk to you about the quality of events. But first into our criteria and their model. To choose the place in which the Olympics will be held each Olympiad, we have a number of criteria to show. The first is that they would have a diplomatic past, that they would be non-confrontational. The second being that their climate would lend themselves to the games, that they can support the games with weather and with empty areas. The third being that they have the administrative infrastructure in order to support having the games in their country. We think that this is conducive to countries such as Sweden and Switzerland. And I think that these are examples that we're going to illustrate what our country would have.
Information, right?
Sure.
If you want to promote culture and sport, isn't it intuitively better to export the Olympics to many different countries over time?
I was going to be getting into that in my points later, and I think that they would really like to hear the model first as to what we're going to be talking about in this resolution today. The model. The International Olympic Committee would approach the country and ask them if they would like to have the Olympics. We think that most countries be honored in order to have this honor of having the Olympics every year, as most countries are just to have them once. We would let the country choose geographically where the Olympics would take place each year, where the Olympics would be placed, where we would make the permanent facility. The payment would be an international effort, and countries that participate in the games would pay a certain amount proportional to the GDP of their country. The International Olympic Committee would get the revenue from things such as tickets and broadcasts. The International Olympic Committee would have an increased responsibility, and their increased responsibility would be to control things such as maintenance of the facilities and to control things such as the Olympic events, like the opening ceremonies. The necessary facilities would be built by the International Olympic Committee in the country that we choose. There would be a different terrain for sports that need a different terrain each year or each Olympics, such as biking, where you need a different course in order for it to be controlled. We would remove the rule that the host country has to compete in every Olympic event, and we would say that no athletes are allowed to train in this Olympic facility, even the people who live in the country in which the facility is. The burdens that we believe we have on side proposition are that this doesn't hinder the Olympic goals, that of promoting culture and sports. And the second being that the practical and principal benefits of this are something that we can prove and something that we believe will be beneficial. The push burdens for side proposition are that there is a unique and irreplaceable benefit to having it in a different country every year. That one location prevents us from fulfilling the Olympic goals, and that it is practically sustainable to have it in a different place every year, and to have it in a different place every Olympics. Into my first point of the Olympic economics. No country has made a profit off of the Olympics since 1960. The overrun for each Olympics since that year has been over 100%. We think that the cost is not only before and during the Olympics, but after, when the country has to provide maintenance to the facilities, and when the country is responsible for the facilities after the Olympics have been long gone. And we think that we're trying to find like a new place in a new continent every time we go for the Olympics. And we think something that proves that these places aren't going to have the opportunity to have these large sports competitions in them very often. We see examples in places such as Athens, where the Olympic Stadium and where the Olympic facilities that were used in the Athens Olympics aren't used at all anymore. And even when they are used, it's for things that could be used in far smaller stadiums. They're just using them because they have the Olympic stadiums there. And it's not exclusive to the Olympics. The South Africa World Cup Stadium is empty most of the time. They have to get tours of the stadium in order to make some amount of money because of the vast expense of maintaining it. It costs $7 to $10 million on average to host the Olympics in your country. No one country should have to foot that bill. It should be an international effort. It should be something that every country has to take part in because every country is showcasing their athletes and showcasing their culture. We think that it's wasteful to have to build a new facility every time you have an Olympics. Every time there's an Olympics, you have to build new stadiums, you have to find new places to have tracks, and we don't think that we should be wasting the Olympic stadiums that we already have. We think that if we build one stadium, it is going to be far better than having to build a new one every 4 years. The second point, that of removing politics from sports. Obviously, politics aren't being held to a high value in the selection of what place is going to be holding the Olympics. And obviously, like, we haven't, what we look at when we're having the Olympics, what's looked at in the status quo is where we haven't been in a while, where we haven't like had the Olympics in a while, whether or not we're going to go into a new continent. We think that the vast perception of why Beijing was chosen for the Olympics over Toronto in Canada was that Beijing had a really nice video package. And Beijing had a really good presentation as to why they should have the Olympics. The politics of Beijing weren't examined, and this leads me perfectly into the second subpoint about the problems of politics in women's sports. And I'm going to talk a little bit about culture later, which deals with the why that we've heard other side opposition. The problems of politics in women's sports.
If you make every country pay to go to the Olympics, doesn't that raise barriers to entry for poor countries, therefore decreasing inclusiveness?
We don't think that this is the case. We think that or rather we don't think that this is like a detriment that like excludes countries from going to the Olympics. We think that countries pay a lot of money to like put athletes in the Olympics anyway. We think that not only do they do this in status quo, but we think that it's their duty to like have some input into what the Olympics is, into how like we pay for the Olympics because they're utilizing this source. And we think that when every country is having an economic input, this is only something that can further the amount of cultural inclusion. If every country is having that input, if every country is being included in that way. We think that there are three main issues when you have politics mainly in the sports. Number one, the politics overshadows sports. We have two examples of this. Thank you. In Moscow, when the Olympics were held there during the Cold War, this was very harmful because the politics of the country, the politics of the city, overran and overbeared over the sports that were taking place, over the athletes that were doing great things for their country. In Beijing, when the vast amount of public press and the vast amount of press releases was due to the fact about the Chinese politics and how that was mingling with the Olympics, it took light away from the athletes who were doing their job and the athletes who were doing their work and who were being athletes. The second is that it changes the perception of the Olympics when you're looking back on the Olympics. It's no longer something that was about the sports, no longer about what the athletes did, but it's about the politics in the country at that time, what the politics were like, and it taints the memory of the Olympics, which is something that countries should be proud to look back upon, not something that countries have to look back upon and see skewed and corrupt politics. The third being that athletes are not political vessels. They should not have to put the cost of being a political vessel for their country. And we think that culture can only be furthered, number one, when these cultures aren't being skewed by this political ideal. Number two, when every culture has an input into the Olympics. And number three, when there is an outlet for these cultures and when we can control what the Olympics are like in a specific country. And it is on that basis that we beg to propose.
Sorry to interrupt, would it be possible to get the time
Yeah,
on that screen?
is it possible to get the time up there?
It's not,
Not working?
no,
If
okay.
anyone needs a timer, I have one.
Sure. Raffles will have 250 times each. Right, it's now my pleasure to summon Grant from, I'm sorry, that's Mr. Brown. From the first opposition position.
We stand for a simple principle that taking turns is no child's play. To refute the case presented by Team Proposition, I want to look at two things. One, economics, and two, politics. First, let's examine the realm of economics. What did Team Proposition bring to us? They effectively told us that no country has ever prospered in hosting the Olympics and that the Olympics is a fundamentally wasteful enterprise. We have a few responses to this. First of all, it is utterly untrue that no countries have ever profited from the Olympics. We give you examples like Atlanta, where the tourism industry was rejuvenated following the 1996. The only reason why they presented this statistic is because they take an incredibly short view of the type of economic gain that arises from hosting the Olympics. Sure, in the Olympics year, there may be a fall in arrivals because of fears of congestion, but in the long run, it places host nations on the world map and consequently boosts the economic prospects of the host city. Therefore, establishing one permanent center will remove the sharing of this benefit with different nations. But even if we are to accept that no country has ever profited economically from the Olympic Games, we tell you that there are intangible gains that nations derive from hosting the Olympics. Let's look at some of the so-called wasteful stadiums that they spoke about. Sure, stadiums like the Bird Nest may never be used for an event on a similar scale, but the presence of the Olympics provides an inspiring landmark that all other athletes in the local sporting scene can aspire to. It creates role models that we can all look up to. And because of that, we argue that even if we accepted that economically hosting the Olympic Games, no, thank you madam, on an institutional basis harms nations, it is still worth it. Clearly, we take the economic in front of the debate. Next, let's examine the political sphere. And here, the heart of all three of team proposition arguments has been the idea that sports should be depoliticized. Again, we have a few responses. First response: why does hosting the Olympic Games in one nation necessarily make it less political? In fact, we argue that the vague and amorphous model proposed by team proposition for the momentum will only make the process of the games more political. Why? Because of the high stakes involved, every nation, be it Greece, England, or Sweden, is going to fight tooth and nail just to get the right to be that one permanent center. And following the decision, nations are going to continue to argue over whether or not it was the right decision to designate that venue as that one center. The legitimacy of the Olympic Games decreases in the eyes of the international community and sports only becomes more political. What do you have to say to that, Madam?
Even if some politics still remain, you're removing some politics by our criteria and by giving the IOC more authority over the Olympics and more control.
Okay, I'm going to show you why this doesn't stand in a constructive argument later, but even if we accepted your argument that somehow we depoliticize the game by establishing a permanent center, we ask, why is the mingling of sports and politics such a bad thing, especially in the context of hosting the Olympics? We give you the example of Beijing in 2008. The Olympic Games turned the world's attention to the country's human rights abuses, and as a consequence, created pressure for the communist government to release more than 2,000 political prisoners. We say that sports can be an instrument for political change and political liberalization, and hence is not an inherently bad thing. For these reasons, we take the political sphere of the debate. I'm going to present three lines of argumentation from my side of the course. I'll prove to you that our model upholds the Olympic spirit, benefits potential host nations, or my section will demonstrate how a rotational hosting of the games enriches the Olympics. The thesis of my first argument is that the model presented by team proposition denigrates the Olympic values of inclusiveness and participation. What are the values that team proposition value? We believe that the Olympics should not be the exclusive purview of a single elite nation, of a country which just so happens to have a right place in history. Hold on a moment. Why is this the case? We think that the Olympics are a unique platform where nations are able to set aside their differences and circumvent their economic disparities. As a consequence, a degree of equality between nations is integral to the Olympic creed. But yet, team proposition is disagrees.
In the current Olympics, would you not agree that most of the emphasis is actually placed on the host country and their culture? And oftentimes the host country has to be able to pay for new facilities. So we're really only experiencing the culture of a few countries.
Okay, two responses to that. First of all, it is untrue that only a few countries have the capacity to host the Olympic Games. We give you examples like Mexico City in 1968. Also, in 1988, emerging from a decade of economic stagnation. These nations might not have been the richest in the world, but yet they were able to aspire towards the goal of the Olympic Games. And that's what I'm going to talk to you right now. Because now I'm now going to demonstrate to you that establishing a permanent center for the Olympic Games violates these values. This happens in two ways. First, it destroys the aspirations of the nations that team competition wants to protect, because they are no longer able to host their own Olympic Games. Hosting the Olympic Games is an important milestone. Why? Because it means that you own a piece of Olympic history, and because it becomes a badge of honor in the nation's journey from third world to first. In so doing, you allow every nation to share their own unique culture and become a part of the Olympic story. To give you an example of Beijing in 2008, the Thank Method, which was widely seen as a coming up party from China after it made transition from a controlled economy to a free market economy. To give you the example of our own nation, Singapore, which hosted the Youth Olympic Games in 2010. For a small nation like us, the ability to welcome these athletes from all over the world under our umbrella was an incredible boost for our national pride, and so it enabled us to put ourselves on the world map. But the second reason why establishing a permanent center for the Olympics hurts the Olympic crew is that individuals living in different nations around the world are denied the opportunity of a lifetime to be up close to the Olympic Games. So the main part of the Olympic Games and main part of sport and culture is not just about watching the athletes on TV. It's about having the chance to be there, watching the athletes live in action, and we argue that it's only when the games rotate from country to country that the most number of people have the opportunity to view this opportunity. For these reasons, we tell that team competition violates the Olympic values. The first method argument is that our model shares the benefits of hosting the games. I want to explore this in a few realms. First of all, on the realm of sports, we argue that rotating the right to host the Olympics create a political impetus to build world-class facilities and infrastructure. Even after they are used, athletes from the local sporting teams continue to use these facilities, and so doing, the local sporting team is valued. For instance, in following the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, the Vietnam Olympic Stadium continues to be used for inner city neighborhood school kids who are often poor and previously denied the opportunity to be part of sport. Furthermore, in the realm of economics, the Olympics are incredibly lucrative because they are able to attract tourism receipts. That's why in places like Sydney, we receive more than $20 billion worth of tourism receipts in the 10 years following the Olympics. For all these reasons, we stand by a simple principle that taking turns should not be child's play.
My pleasure now to invite the second affirmative speaker, Oliver, to present his argumentation.
For every example we've heard of shared benefits, and we would repeat a lot of these, we believe the true issue today is the idea of these, when we share these so-called benefits, when we share the Olympics, what we're truly sharing is harms. When we send this to one nation, we think that those are eliminated. Let's go through what we've heard from the first opposition speaker so far. Firstly, their response to our idea of Olympic economics. What they basically told you is that this idea of overrun that we told you about, the statistics that we use, were something that were based on a short-term basis. And they brought up the example of Atlanta actually several times as an example of a bastion for when the Olympics truly are beneficial for a country. We would say that that might be one example that they brought up, but we would say just consequentially, in response to this, there's the example of say, Montreal, which hosted the 1967 Olympic Games. They didn't fully repay back their debt until 2007. We don't think that this is necessarily a benefit that happens in every city. They brought up one example, so I guess we're even on that one. And then they brought up this they brought up the idea, secondly, that this Olympic stadium that would be created is something that people can look up to for the rest of their lives. We'd say when that isn't something that's maintained, and that was something that was said in the response, no matter whether it's maintained or not, whether it's used or not, it's still going to be this pinnacle. We'd say that that's not necessarily true. We'd say the bird's nest is actually a quite fragile structure that might not look so good in later years. We don't think that these sort of rotting institutions that aren't going to be maintained very well are really going to be setting an example of the success that a country has in their sport. Instead, it's going to be a quite sad message to these individuals that their country, in fact, doesn't have a very good chance of succeeding in these areas. Second point, the idea of politics in sports. What they told you is that what we're going to be deciding for really the remaining period that the Olympics exists is whether it was a good idea to put these Olympics where we put them. First of all, we'd say that that's something that's quite unlikely. We'd say that the consistent, one of the good things about having these games in one place is that the efforts of that city or the efforts of that country are going to be quite consistent. We're not going to see, oh, well, they had a down year this time, when really we have all the same variables in place. We have the same city, we have similar facilities, we have similar accommodations, all these sort of things. My point is actually talking about that quite a bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but we think that there's going to be a consistent effort each time. Secondly, we'd say when this isn't such a controversial country, we think what that basically says is that there isn't going to be so much of this competitiveness after the fact. No one's going to be all that angry at a country like Switzerland or Sweden when they haven't really been before. It's quite a petty issue to actually start a significant issue about. Then they ask the question, why is it such a bad idea to have politics involved with sports? We'd say again, we have to look back to the original principles in which the Olympics are founded upon. That people coming from each country doesn't necessarily have to be a competitive issue. That in fact, there's an idea of representing your country beyond political goals, where you can't necessarily control what sort of a country your country is, but that you are an individual that just happens to come from a certain country. We're really looking at the best athletes in the world, not the best countries. Okay. Sure.
The bidding process to host the Olympics every 4 years is already one that's fraught with complications. Prove to us how the bidding process to host the Olympics forever will be completely peaceful and will not be tainted by politics at all.
Well, it only happens once. So we'd say that that even if it is a bigger process, it probably would be, yeah, that will never happen again in the history of the Olympics, and that's something that's pretty beneficial. We don't think it's going to be so much more of a deal that will compensate for them never happening again. Okay. Now to deal with the points that they brought up. Firstly, they brought up the idea of exclusivity and how it's great to put this in developing nations because they have a badge of honor. We'd say that's a $10 billion badge of honor. We'd say that for a developing country, that's not something that's going to have long-term economic success associated with it. We don't think that Mexico has actually become that greatly of a more developed country since these Olympics, and we don't think that would have been a result of the Olympics anyway. What we would say is that there have been studies done that happiness doesn't go, like, you can measure happiness, but happiness doesn't necessarily go up in the city that the Olympics are hosted in while they're being hosted. But there are equal detriments to hosting an Olympics, say if you're not that interested in sports or something like that. Okay, then, so we don't think this badge of honor is something that's necessarily worth it. Then we have the idea of shared benefits. And what we were basically told is that some of these stadiums are used, and that's really great. We'd say that there aren't many countries in which every stadium will be used, and when there's only some of them used, countries are going to get new stadiums. Most new stadiums are not because of the Olympics. We don't think that you necessarily see much of the city when the Olympics are being hosted, but just these stadiums, we don't necessarily think that people are going to think much more of the city. Now on to my constructive argument, the idea of the quality of the events. This breaks down two ways. Firstly, in the idea of facilities, and secondly, in the idea of home field advantage. So firstly, the idea of the facilities. We'd say you work out the kinks when you hold the Olympics a number of times. The issue in London that's been had primarily with the budget is that it was calculated without really accounting for the level of security that would be needed for those games. That's something that's made it so that they originally thought they would profit off of these Olympics, but that's something very unlikely to happen. The idea of, no thanks. The idea of transportation is also something that has to be worked out from individual cities, and sometimes they don't get this quite down. Then we say the maintenance of external factors, so something like the airport, something like accommodations would be at a constant level. Beijing had problems with accommodations, where in their Olympic village they had issues with bed bugs. Yeah.
The competition between the nations and their national pride to put on a good show will drive the Olympics to higher and higher levels.
We think what would drive the Olympics to higher and higher levels is a consistent basis of funding that wouldn't necessarily come from that country. We think there's always going to be a demand for a good Olympics, that when you actually have these issues viewed on a world scale, then that means that next year they'll be fixed. You don't get a second chance at an Olympics. When you messed it up the first time, you don't have a chance to immediately get it right again in the next 4 years. Then there's the issue with the quality event of saying, world records. So this wouldn't apply to things like biking, where there has to be different terrain, and sometimes that doesn't impact this. But something like running, we'd say an issue that we had in the Mexico City Olympics is that it happened at a higher altitude. It's actually easier to run in that altitude, so a lot of world records were set at that event. We think if it's a consistent basis, that'll lead to more consistent results. A world record is a big deal. When they're set at the Olympics, that's something that should have integrity more than certainly does now. Secondly, the idea, so in this point, the idea of home field advantage. What we'd say is because of cultural differences, we cannot ensure that every country is going to be able to compete in every sport. And we have this sort of principle of the Olympics that we don't have sports competitions where every nation of the world is involved. We have it, so it's the best nations, the best athletes that are involved in these competitions. We think it's a very silly reason to go beyond this principle when it just happens to be the host nation that certainly they are able to do this. We outlined in the plan that we would get rid of this idea of home field advantage because we think that would greatly increase the quality of sport. That's not something that would happen during our plan. We think that means better Olympics. Great Britain has never deserved having an Olympic basketball team. They have one this year. We think that's something that will make the average basketball game worse. Thanks.
How long did you say?
Okay. 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
8, 12.
8.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to invite Antovichka, and sorry if that's mispronounced, to present the second opposition.
I get scolded by my coach a lot for debating practical issues too much. So it's funny for me to be standing here in this debate and being on the side that's telling you about the spirit of the Olympics and how it's important to have the flavor and uniqueness that comes with having rotated host nation, as opposed to a side that comes up and only talks about practical benefits, practical arts, economics, and politics. So I'm going to deal with this debate in two contradictory sections. First of all, what's in the spirit of the Olympics? Second, do host nations really benefit from their policy? So under the first one, we think it's very telling that side proposition came up and told us that their criteria is that they don't hinder the aims of the Olympics, as opposed to furthering the aims of the Olympics. And their entire first proposition constructed had nothing whatsoever about the Olympic spirit. The contrast came in our side when we told you right from first opposition that the Olympics is founded on inclusiveness, on the idea that any country should have the ability to have the glory and the honor and the ability to host the Olympics because every country is equal in terms of sport and its sporting. Their only response to this was to try to bring it back to the practical side, which didn't even deal with how we are. They told us that this badge of honor comes at the cost of $10 million. Well, we tell you that, well, that's a trade-off that cities have to make, right? If a city like Rio de Janeiro in a country like Brazil makes the trade-off that spending all that money is worth the long-term benefit that I'm going to tell you about, and is worth the honor that they're hosting the Olympics, going to that country, then it's fine for the country to make that trade-off, as long as it is in the spirit of the Olympics. But they haven't actually tackled the heart of this argument, have they? The point is more this, that the spirit and the value of the Olympics is that of equality, that of inclusiveness, that every single country should have the right to bring something new to the Olympic Games every time they host it. And that is something that they have to deal with and they have to understand. Furthermore, they have refused to deal with my first opposition speaker's point about how individuals should be able to go and watch the Olympics, and how when you rotate the Olympics, more people get the chance to do that, to go down to the stadiums, to go down to the track, to be in your country's colours, and to support your athletes there in person. If you deny people around the world that chance, we say it's not in the spirit of inclusiveness. They try to counter this with the idea that it's about athletes, that the Olympics is only about athletes. We see that's a naive conception of what the Olympics is about. Because the Olympics isn't just about sport, it's about how people see it, it's about how people participate in it. Therefore, that's not a principle that can stand on their side. Last of all on this point of contention, I'm going to deal with the second proposition tonight. It first basically is that once countries do it, once the host country does it more and more, they get better and better at it. We say, doesn't that make the Olympics so boring, so mechanical, so robotic? It just means that every time the Olympics is hosted, it's the same thing being done over and over again. And we don't think that adds any value to the Olympics at all. Hold on a moment. Last of all, we call for consistent results and home field advantage. We don't think that these are significant factors, adding 0.001 seconds less to your race timing, and we think that furthermore, we should be allowed to share the home advantage among many countries, as opposed to only giving to one country every single time. Go.
Could you please explain why a nation would stagnate the evolution of improving the quality of the Olympics until it gets like a perfect place? Could you please elaborate on the fact that it becomes mechanical as opposed to improving?
Because there's no incentive for them to improve it every time, because they are guaranteed the right to host the Olympics every time they have it. Whereas on the outside, as I'm going to describe a massive standard, clearly there's competitiveness and a competition that leads to innovation every time the Olympics are hosted. But let's move on to the second kind of contention, right? Let's talk about practical issues. They told us that countries lose money. They told us that no, there are spin-off benefits, especially in terms of the tourism industry, and they give you examples of this as well. My first opposition speaker also told me that it's good for athletes, because once you build the infrastructure, we can promote the local sporting scene as is happening, and so cheap where winter sports is becoming the new fad. Well, I'm going to take this argument one step further by telling you that it helps put countries on the world map. That's what happened when Seoul and when China hosted the Olympics. And there are other benefits, such as bringing that nation to the world, something that you cannot measure in terms of money won or money lost. They try to refute this argument by saying that, oh, our argument is based solely on the example of Atlanta. They try to rebut it using the example of Montreal. We say, no, this argument isn't example-based. There are systemic benefits. These systemic benefits are benefits like tourism, like making other countries more aware of their country. And you have to rebut this based on our systemic logic rather than just pay as example. Next, they told us that facilities are being wasted. They tell you that's not true, right? The problem, therefore, the problem if facilities are being wasted is with the countries, not with the system of rotation itself. It's very easy to put these kind of infrastructure to good use. For example, the water tube in China is being used as a sporting facility right now. It's very easy to put these infrastructure to good use as long as the country is willing to do it. They try to tell us, oh, these institutions are rotting. We say, okay, then maintain them, which isn't very expensive, or use them for other purposes. For example, the Bird's Nest Stadium is being used as a museum right now. Last point of rebuttal on politics. We agree that politics in sport is bad, but they haven't shown us why restricting it to one country will remove the idea of politics. In fact, under their side, the one country that is hosting the Olympics has to bear the brunt of all political problems. For example, if Sweden has a spat with Finland, Finland will keep boycotting the Olympics in Sweden, making the problem even worse. They try to say, well, pick a country with no problem, and we say there's no such country in the world. Furthermore, your global bidding process, as he already told you, is going to create problems of such great magnitude and great controversy, they're not going to be able to solve the problem. Let me now move on to my constructive case, about how rotating venues enriches the Olympic Games. Let's first detail to you the bidding process of the Olympics. Several years in advance, the host countries assemble a bid committee, put forward proposals. They submit a bid to the IOC, and they therefore propose ideas on how they're going to conduct the Olympic Games in their country. Then begins the long process of inspection, right? IOC members visit these countries, listen to presentations by the bid committees, and they take into account the various factors, such as the innovativeness of the ideas that these countries are presenting, the capabilities of their infrastructure, as well as the potential benefit to these host nations. For example, Rio de Janeiro submitted their bid way back in 2004 and went through this extensive bidding process before they finally got the right to host the Olympics in 2009. What this rigorous process then implies is that there's a positive competition between countries competing to host the Olympics to bring new ideas to the table. Hold a moment now. They push themselves to generate new ideas about how to make the Olympics better and better each time, so they can prove to the IOC that they are worthy of hosting the Olympic Games. Before I move on.
Under our model, the IOC would be running the Olympics. Why would an institution whose reputation is on the line not want to produce a quality event?
Then we're not just talking about quality here, right? We're talking about innovativeness. And there are things inherent to having different countries host the Olympics that generate innovativeness. For example, every single country has their own unique culture and their unique background to be able to bring new ideas to the table. Whereas if you had just the IOC trying to generate ideas, clearly these ideas are going to be of less magnitude in terms of innovation and creativity than if you have various countries competing to bring these ideas to the table. What this means, moving back to my constructive, is that every time the games are hosted, value is added. And this happens in two ways. First of all, it improves the systems of games themselves. For example, in Athens, they were able to allocate personal care officers for every single athletics team, as well as to improve broadcasting technology, such as bringing ultra-slow motion for tennis players. This is good for the athletes as well as for the viewers, because it brings about a better system of the Olympic Games as well as better viewership. But even more importantly, it adds flavor to every Olympic Games, because each Olympiad has its own unique features and defining characteristics. For example, the Bird's Nest Stadium and the water park are seen as defining features of the Beijing Olympics. This keeps people engaged in the Olympics and it keeps people excited in the Olympic spirit. And that is why it is good for the Olympics as a whole. Therefore, because our side brings benefits to various countries and as well as preserving the Olympic spirit, our side is set to go.
Right, it's now my pleasure to call Lisa to present the
Side opposition's case consists of benefits of improving the Olympics, of benefits of having different cultures represented. But the thing that side opposition has not proven to you today, ladies and gentlemen, is why all of those benefits cannot be achieved if it's in a singular country. They have not shown you why something like an international body like the IOC can replicate those benefits in other ways or alternative methods if it's in one city. They have failed to show you why their method is the only way to achieve these benefits. On side proposition, we don't dispute the fact that the Olympics should improve, that we should be innovative, that we should try different things and strive for the best. That is not our burden. What we told you on side proposition, we will continue to prove, is that the benefits listed on side opposition can all come under our model. Now I'm going to break down today's debate into the three main areas of clash. That is the economics of this debate, the politics and sports, and finally, like the quality and the Olympic spirit. So let's begin with this idea of economics. What we heard from side opposition was basically that the Olympics are always incredibly lucrative and that every country makes a huge profit, and Atlanta made money and their tourism went up, and so therefore we think that countries make a lot of money off of the Olympics and they're really lucrative. First off, we rejected that assumption and that assertion actually from the premise. We think that a significant majority of countries actually lose money from hosting the Olympics. We brought to the example of Montreal, we also saw Calgary lost money, we think the Athens lost money, but why is this, ladies and gentlemen? Because we haven't really heard that today. Why do these countries lose money? It's not just the systems and the facilities that they have to build. What we see is that they often have to build bigger transportation systems. They often have to build a lot of bigger infrastructural things within the city. A lot of hotels go up, a lot of restaurants go up. Things that cannot be sustained afterwards. A lot of these facilities are built to sustain a certain capacity of individuals, but that can never be replicated. So what we think is that it's going to be lost because it can never be used to the same extent again. They told us that even if it were an economic burden, so they can see that that would possibly be an outcome, and we think that's what it is most of the time. They told you that money wouldn't be an issue because it would be some sort of symbol of hope. And because the Olympics were held there once, it would somehow bring the nation or the city together enough to cost $10 billion, not this time. First off, we told you in all of our speech that it's not necessarily going to be a bastion of hope. We think that like if your country doesn't do well, something goes wrong with the event, it could be a constant reminder of something that went wrong. Moreover, if we look at other international stadiums that were built for a sporting event, they don't serve as a fashion code. For example, the World Cup soccer stadium in Cape Town, South Africa. We actually see the stadium as viewed with a lot of resentment from the people because it was seen as a huge waste of money from the people. Right? The people viewed the stadium as a large waste of their tax-paying money. So we don't think that that's exactly a bastion of hope and glory. That you disagree.
We've already told you that this is not a problem with the system's location. If the countries want to use it to put it to better use, then they can. And it's happened before in the case of the Bird's Nest Stadium.
Right, so we think that like some countries will, make this decision, will decide to like spend their money on that. We still don't think that that actually deals with the content that you brought up. The content that you tried to say that these stadiums and whatnot would be a positive image. We don't think they would be. But furthermore, even if they were, we say like at what cost? We think that you can create a spirit of hope and connection within society that doesn't cost you $10 billion, that isn't a stadium that sits empty or maybe operates as like a touring facility. Lastly, they told you that like there are systemic benefits because tourism is increased within countries, so you can bring your country to the global scale. We think that this isn't actually always true, because a lot of times that individuals don't bring more money into tourism. They never actually told you like why this is the case. They never really gave us an example besides Atlanta. But furthermore, we see that a lot of countries could lose tourism within London, because a lot of people are equally deterred to vacation there, for example, in London, as they are to actually go to visit these Olympics. So you lose a lot of tourism revenue. Now, the second area of clash in today's debate is the idea of politics. And so, basically, we told you on side proposition Morris speech that mixing the two are bad. And what we heard on side opposition is a questioning in the first speaker of saying, why is mixing politics and sports bad? They said it was a good thing, because they brought up the example of prisoners in China. But then we had their second speaker come up and tell us that politics and sports are a bad thing. But we see that the case line between the two hasn't actually been consistent. So we'd like them to clarify their position on that. Let's deal with the first stance they presented. The idea that politics and sports is a good thing because of the example of prisoners in China being released. First off, we think that this is a huge issue because it actually clouds the results. We think that these prisoners could have been released by putting pressure on the country in other ways or any mechanisms. We don't think it's the responsibility of sports to do that. Rory brought up 3 subpoints and 3 analysis as to why it actually bad to mix politics and sports, and we never heard a reply to her analysis about the fact that it overshadows the event, taints the history of it, and actually makes athletes political vessels. Then they told you that this would be a very political decision, and that this is going to be an issue for the individuals hopefully, because the conflict over picking the one nation would be so political. First off, we recognize that this isn't going to be fit. We see that there's criteria put in place that it's going to be a decision based on external factors. Moreover, we think that it's going to be less political on the whole, because this decision is going to be made once. We don't think it's going to be a consistent issue that we have within the Olympic Games. Finally, we think that the type of politics that happens with this and the political controversy that might occur over this decision wouldn't be the type that hinders the goals of the game. It's not the type that overshadows the result year for year. It's not the type that actually takes away from the athletes, and it's not the type that puts the athletes in a bad situation, because it's nothing to do with the country itself. Lastly, they brought up this idea of politics. Well, what happens if the home country gets into a conflict? What happens if they decide to do something that might be considered political? First off, we say the criteria that we put in place based on like, we see that the country of Switzerland haven't been in a conflict in 100 years. No, thank you. For more, we see that if that conflict does occur, we don't believe it's going to be as big an issue because of the fact that the systems are already in place. We think that it's not going to be as epidemic as they thought. Now, the last idea is quality of sports and events, and this idea of the spirit of the Olympics. And what we heard from the second speaker was that side proposition didn't talk to you at all about the spirit of the Olympics and why that's important. When in fact, Rory's analysis about the politics of sports directly touched on that. The fact that the politics overshadow the spirit of sport. The fact that the politics get in the way of truly valuing the athletes and the culture and everyone coming together and can actually be divisive. They never replied to that, no thank you. So basically their first assertion under this idea of quality events, they said that we can showcase more cultures because we rotate countries. What we say is that that's not 100% true. We don't think all countries are going to have the opportunity to do so. We don't think developing countries are going to have the same ability to outbid a country like China. We don't think we're going to be showcasing all these cultures. We believe that we're going to have better access to do that when we keep it in one place. But let's look at an example of the POI that I asked. I asked about the British Open, about the British Games. Right? If we look at the opening ceremonies of the British Olympics, we see it was basically a history of the country. We only really got to celebrate and enjoy one country's history. It wasn't an international event. What we recognize on-site proposition is that if the game is hosted in one location, then the opening ceremonies could say be more international, more representative of different countries instead of only focusing on one. We never heard a reply to that. Then they brought up this idea, again, that we didn't touch spirits, but Rory's argument about politics and sports really dealt with that. Then they told us that developing nations could host these, so it could bring your country to the forefront, it could be a bash in the cold and a bag in the front. They said that they made this choice to spend large money on it, so it was their choice to make. So don't you think that it's costly, so not a lot of them are going to be able to make the choice. So the benefits that they put forth wouldn't actually take place. So we don't think this concept of developing nations would actually happen. Then they brought up this weird argument in the second speech about the idea that the Olympics would for some reason become mechanical. The idea that there wouldn't be an incentive to innovate or get international perspectives on how to improve the event. We think that one, when the IOC is running something, they're always going to want to improve it to try and find a better way because it's their international reputation on the line. We think there's no reason why they would not want to improve the games. Furthermore, we see the IOC as an international community. We think that they would also have a multiplicity of ideas and be able to be equally as innovative. What we see is that they can also come up with flavor for each event. We don't believe that it is only capable, like only a country can come up with innovative ideas or create a flavor to each different Olympic event. What we see on side proposition is practical and principal benefits to creating one Olympic center. And what we see on side opposition is a list of benefits to improving the Olympics, but not benefits that are exclusive to having them in different countries. And it's for these reasons that we beg to vote.
Right, it's now my pleasure to invite the third opposition speaker from the Singapore, Raffles, I'm sorry, to present her presentation.
The Olympic Games cannot be a question of dollars and cents. That is the stance of side opposition from the start of this debate. So let me prove to you three things today. Firstly, I'll prove to you that we are the side that protects Olympic values. Secondly, I'll prove to you that we are the side that ensures the quality and consistency of the Olympic Games. And thirdly, I'll prove to you that we are the side that benefits host nations the most. So firstly, on how we protect Olympic values, which I'll be looking through two main lenses. Firstly, I'll prove to you how our side is the one that is consistent with the spirit of the Olympic Games. And secondly, I'll prove to you how our side does not allow politics to overshadow sports. So firstly, on how our side is more consistent with the spirit of the Olympic Games. When Pierre de Coubertin established the modern Olympic Games in 1896, one of the fundamental guiding principles beyond just athletic excellence was the coming together of several different nations into one venue, the interaction between these nations and the international spirit of brotherhood that it created. This was the vision that he created. Now, why is having a bidding process, how is having different nations party to this important? And we'll prove to you that this is exclusive to our model today. We say that essentially when different nations are allowed to bid for the Olympic Games, it creates a greater spirit of inclusiveness. Because the Olympic Games cannot be the sole property of Sweden or Switzerland or Denmark or whatever other nation you want. The Olympic Games has to be an international property. Every country should have the right to bid, to compete, to host the Olympic Games, to have the pride and honor and all the benefits that accrue from the Olympic Games within their nations. That is the spirit of inclusiveness that we think is important to preserve. So moving on to the next issue of politics, in which they constantly brought up this idea of how politics and sports just cannot mix. We think this is a fairly outmoded idea, because the Olympic Games has evolved from the old Grecian ideal of where you only celebrate sporting excellence. Sure, sporting excellence is still a huge part of the Olympic Games, but we cannot distance it from the fact that politics and national pride do come into play. But even when they do come into play, they do not overshadow sports, but rather help to benefit it. We gave you countless examples of formerly repressive, closed nations such as Seoul, such as China, such as Tokyo, that have been forced to open up because of international pressure and the scrutiny that came with the Olympic Games. This is the higher ideal of sports, in which it's not just about who runs the fastest, but who jumps the furthest, but rather it shows you how much this Olympic game actually truly matters, in which it improves political systems of the games. This is the true spirit of the Olympic game that exists. We say that essentially, we don't think there's a problem in which politics enters sports, and we don't think there's a situation, thank you in a moment, madam, we don't think there's a situation in which politics taints or overshadows sports. Go, madam.
If that is your case, Dan, could you please explain why your second speaker said that they should not mix?
Well, my second speaker did not say that, in which is my simple response to that. He has never told you that politics and sports cannot mix, but rather he told you that even if we accept your logic that politics and sports cannot mix, we still think that our model is the way forward because of the inclusiveness that it creates across nations. So on the bidding process, they talked to us about how the 4-year bidding process is highly political and highly controversial. Now let's just take a step back and be a little realistic about things. If a 4-year bidding process is something that countries can always, like if you lose the Olympic Games in 2012, you can again bid for it in bid for the 2016 one. If even these kind of bidding processes are so fraught with political controversy, why would a worldwide bidding process for a country to forever host the Olympic Games not be fraught with political controversy? Don't tell us that it's a petty issue, because it's not. Because countries value the Olympic Games. That's precisely why they compete so much to win their bid. That's precisely why it's fraught with political controversy, because it's so important. It's not a petty issue. And there's no one country in which you can say, well, we'll just pick a country which every country is okay with. Because there's no single country. If you pick Sweden or Denmark or Switzerland, all the Asian nations will complain because you're prioritizing Western liberal democracies. And similarly, you pick an Asian country. This will be fraught with political controversy. And to tell us that increasing the authority of the IOC will automatically make all political considerations irrelevant does not really make sense. Because we have to acknowledge that the IOC itself is made up of individuals with different nationalities, with different political affiliations. They're not a faceless, emotionless body, and it's not a case in which every country will completely and utterly trust their authority. So even vesting more power and autonomy to the IOC will not work. So moving on to the next issue of the improvement of the Olympic Games, which I'll be dealing with on two main angles. Firstly, on how our side improves the quality of the Olympic Games, and secondly, on how our side ensures that the cultures of different nations are showcased at the Olympic Games and how this is important. So firstly, on our side ensures the improvement of the quality of the Olympic Games. This is where my second speaker's analysis of how they talk about a purely mechanical Olympic Games comes in. Their issue is that, well, there might be slight inconsistency. In Mexico City, someone ran a fraction of a second longer and that became a huge controversy. But that isn't what the Olympic Games is about. But what we say with equality is that it's purely an issue of economies of scale. Multiple countries with different viewpoints and diverse backgrounds will always be able to innovate and come with creative solutions on how to come up with a different Olympic Games every 4 years, as compared to a small group of old men and women sitting in a room and deciding how the Olympic Games should be run. Which is why we see that each Olympic Games, hold on a moment, madam, brings with it its own local flavor and ideas and innovation. Go, madam.
What prevents organizational committees from taking input from other countries or getting ideas from around the world?
Well, we say that even if they do so, there's an issue in which you have to insert local flavor within these Olympic Games. And this will create even more controversy because it will create an issue of which sets of ideas they are willing to accept and whether there's a bias inherent within this. So essentially, we prove to you that the quality of the Olympic Games is improved when different countries have a chance to bid for it. And this is why we see different cases. And it's not just a case of how countries are forced to pump more and more money into the Olympic Games in order to improve the quality, but rather the innovation that they put into the Olympic Games, the weight that they take on the Olympic Games because of their different background changes. Secondly, on the idea of culture. And this is an issue which is completely exclusive to our model. The idea of cultural sharing and coming together. Because when it's held in a different host nation every year, rather than just one single place, we allow for a greater exchange of cultural ideas. When an athlete from the United States goes to Rio de Janeiro in 2016, he learns more about the culture there. When he goes somewhere else in 2020, he learns more about the culture there. This is a cultural exchange that we promote, and having one fixed venue takes this cultural exchange irrevocably away. So moving on to the last issue of how it benefits host nations. And this is where we think they take a very myopic view of the profits that occurred by the Olympic Games. It's not just a question of I spend $50 on the Olympic Games, I get 52 in return. That isn't the way the Olympic Games works. But it's rather the huge intangible things that come from the Olympic Games, putting your country on the world map, allowing the world to know that your country is ready to show itself on the world stage, as we've seen with so many other countries. These are the profits that host nations get, and to say that only one nation can receive this is completely elitist. So we've proven to you that we preserve the spirit of the Olympic Games and we benefit host nations the most. Therefore, if you believe in the Olympics, please walk with side opposition.
My pleasure now to invite Chu Gan Yan,
From the start of this debate, the rallying cry of team opposition has been clear. Pass it on. I'm going to show you why by taking you on a tour of the world of team opposition. To begin with, this is a world that has even more controversy and more politics over the shroud of the Olympics. They claim that it's a one-off bidding process to establish a permanent standard, but they don't understand the magnitude and the gravity of what they are doing. Every 4 years when we host the Olympic Games, newspaper headlines all over the world are going to scream, was Sweden the right choice for the permanent standard of the Olympics? Pass it on, citizens, and that by finally, on their own ground of depoliticizing the Olympic Games, it is a world that contradicts its name. But not just that. It's also a world that the Olympic Games are mechanical and clinical. Why? Because what they stand for is doing the same thing over and over again. And so they achieve some semblance of what they term perfection in hosting the Games. But in fact, hosting the Great Olympics isn't about getting a right number of security guards. It's not about arranging care officers in a way that gets you the fastest from the airport to the game venue. It's about injecting a new flavor, a new culture into every Olympic experience. And so they making every Olympic Games a unique part of Olympic Games. This is the world that team proposition sacrifices. Finally, the world of team proposition is one that unites the kid in the slum in rural situations, or a child in Beijing who wants to be a world-class gymnast, from looking on and being a part of the Olympic Games. Why? Because it is a world where the Olympics are consigned to a singular elite nation, that ordinary people from all over the world will rather have the unique opportunity to be there and to do that and to be a living and breathing part of Olympic history. There's a world where these children will only be able to be a part of Olympic history through their television screens. And that's why it's a world that fundamentally contradicts the ideals of the Olympic history. And hands up, let's take a walk to the world of team opposition. First and foremost, in dollars and cents, it is a world that benefits both nations. Why? Sure, we have said that there may be some congestion and speeding problems, but the fact of the matter is that economic benefit doesn't just come in the Olympic year. The intangible value that it brings includes putting a nation on the world map, bringing tourists there for decades following the Olympic Games, the Olympic landmark that has become an inextricable part of a country's history and of the Olympic heritage. It is in this way that we benefit nations economically. But more importantly, we told you that even if you are to accept that the Olympics are politicized in the bidding process, we told you that in our world, politics isn't necessarily a bad thing. Why? Because often, sport can be an instrument of political change and political liberalization. We told you about Beijing 2008, when more than 2,000 political prisoners were released. These were lives that team opposition was prepared to sacrifice. But most of all, the war of team opposition was one of aspiration and hope. It was a war where every nation around the world, be it Mexico or China, can aspire to own a piece of Olympic history. Sure, it may not happen in the here and now, but the fact of the matter is that chance exists. This was fantastic against a world where there are with the exclusive property of a singular nation. And for all these reasons, it was our right to actually help out the Olympic cause.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to invite the final speech from Rory for the opposition.
Throughout the round, we've seen a side opposition who has been living in an ideal world, where the politics and the practical implications of the Olympics don't have to interact with the Olympic spirit. And we wish that this world was the case, but it simply is not. We have to consider the practical implications if we want the Olympic spirit to be allowed to further itself, to be allowed to prosper. And that is something that's been ignored by side opposition, in the fact that none of their arguments dealt with the practical implications of moving the Olympics every year. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is that of the Olympic spirit. The second thing being that of the practical implications, because those are the two main things in which this round boils down. The points that we brought to you under the theme of Olympic spirit were removing politics from sports, and about how this is something that can only further the Olympic spirit of inclusion, of different cultures coming together, of cultural expression. What we heard about this is that politics in sport isn't a bad thing. But we don't think that the Olympics were meant as a political tool. These athletes weren't meant to be a political tool. These athletes are meant to compete in a sport, to represent their country's athletic ability and culture. We didn't hear any response or any adequate analysis as to why these athletes are the ideal tool in politics. Then Oliver talked to you about how the quality of events would impact the Olympic spirit in a very beneficial way. When you have a good facility, when you have the kinks worked out of the Olympics, this is the ideal forum for this change, for this Olympic spirit to prosper. The points that we heard from them under the theme of Olympic spirit were the point titled Olympic Spirit, and about how international brotherhood is a good thing. We agree. We don't think that we're proving, we don't think that we're getting rid of this under a bill. We don't think that we're getting rid of this under a model. We think that in fact we're furthering it because we're removing the politics. We're having the International Olympic Committee be the main body, which is something that is going to be beneficial. Then they talked about shared benefits. We think that a lot of what they talked about is some people in the country who get to see the Olympics when they wouldn't really have any means to see it before. The underprivileged people in the slums of Rio de Janeiro aren't going to get to see the Olympics because it's expensive when you have the Olympics to see them. They're not going to get to see the Olympics. They're going to have the detrimental effect of their city being more overcrowded than it was before. They're going to have the detrimental effect of not being able to do that. So side opposition has failed to fulfill their burden that we placed on the beginning of the round, that the benefit is irreplaceable and that one location prevents any benefit. And we have proved our burden about how this does not hinder the Olympic goals and about how these goals can still be fulfilled. Now into the second theme, that of practical implications. What we brought to you, the 2 points that we had, are that of Olympic economics, about how the Olympics are too expensive and are very expensive and not practical to happen in a different country every year. And then another element of quality of events. And practically, these facilities would be much better off if we have the opportunity to improve them every year. It wouldn't cost as much if we can use the facilities that we already have and simply add on to what we had before. This will only further the level of Olympics. What they said is simply a refutation. They didn't have a practical point on their side of the debate. They talked about how bidding is the only way for cultural diversity in the Olympics. We disagree with this on side of opposition. We think that there are many ways for cultural diversity in the Olympics, and by having everybody input in them economically, which has been undealt with by side opposition, this is another way to provide international brotherhood that side opposition would like to call it. Then they talked about this idea of political prisoners. We don't think the Olympics are the ideal tool to free political prisoners. We can pressure countries in other ways to do that. We have proved our burden that we outlined at the beginning of this round, that it is practically preferable and sustainable to have them in Olympics. And they have failed to prove their burden that we laid on them, that it is practically sustainable. And they have failed to do this by not having any point as to this resolution practically. Because the motto of the Olympics is higher, faster, stronger, not anything to do with politics.
Right, thank you both teams for, in fact, a very interesting debate. We are stimulating debate on both sides. taking out to make stimulation decisions. I'm glad you back
Okay, thank you.